Controversy over a renovation project reveals the crumbling relationship between President Trump and Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell. Plans to upgrade the Fed's Washington headquarters will cost $2.5 billion. The Trump administration calls the work, quote, an ostentatious overhaul, and has even suggested maybe it's against the law. Chairman Powell says, I'm quoting now, "We have taken great care to ensure the project is carefully overseen since it was first approved by the board in 2017, end quote. CNN's Brian Todd takes a closer look into the building controversy.
Sitting on a coveted property alongside Washington's National Mall, two stately marble-facaded buildings, now ringed by construction fencing, covered in scaffolding, so-called blue-skin waterproof coverings on the windows. The two buildings, headquarters of the Federal Reserve, and their costly renovation are President Trump's latest weapon in his war against Fed Chairman Jerome Powell.
I mean, it's possible there's fraud involved with the $2.7 billion renovation. This is a renovation.
The president indicating that while it's unlikely he'll fire Powell, it could still happen if fraud is involved in the $2.5 billion renovation, a project that's been hammered on by the president and his allies for weeks.
The one thing I didn't see him as a guy that needed a palace to live in. I think when you spend $2.5 billion on really a renovation, I think it's pretty disgraceful.
Of course, Powell doesn't live in the building, but that hasn't stopped Trump from tying him to the renovation, the cost of which has shot up in recent years, from $1.9 billion to $2.5 billion. The Fed says the buildings had to be upgraded because their electrical grids, plumbing, HVAC, and fire detection systems were antiquated. The buildings were constructed almost 100 years ago. There have been claims that the renovation would include expenditures for lavish items like rooftop gardens, water features, and VIP elevators.
It sends the wrong message to spend public money on luxury upgrades that feel more like they belong in the Palace of Versailles than a public institution.
But Powell and the Fed say those features were either not in the plans or were scaled back.
Some of those are just flatly misleading. The idea of elevators, it's the same elevator. It's been there since the building was built. So that's a mischaracterization, and some of those are no longer in the plans.
The Fed says the cost overruns are really due to things like the cost of removing more asbestos than anticipated, soil contamination, and inflation.
I think the building is just a sideshow. It's an excuse to make life miserable for Jay Powell because President Trump, who of course appointed him, doesn't like what he's doing.
What Powell is doing is not moving aggressively enough for Trump's liking to lower interest rates.
He's a knucklehead. He should have cut interest rates a long time ago.
Powell's resisted rate cuts out of concerns that Trump's tariffs could spark more inflation. But Trump and his allies continue their relentless pressure on Powell. Trump's budget director Russell Vought sending a recent letter to Powell saying the president was extremely troubled by his management of the Fed, including his, quote, ostentatious overhaul of the headquarters. Now, according to a source familiar with the matter who spoke to CNN, Jerome Powell has asked the Fed's Inspector General to conduct an additional review of this renovation. Powell has only 10 months left in his term unless Trump can find cause to remove him sooner. Analyst David Wessel says he doesn't think the controversy over this project would stand up in court as a credible cause for removing Powell. Brian Todd, CNN, Washington.
All right, let's dig deeper now. Joining us to discuss is Bloomberg reporter Amara Omokwe. She covers the Federal Reserve and U.S. economy. Amara, great to see you. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so renovations were initially slated in 2019 for $1.9 billion, but costs have risen to $2.5 billion, covering two buildings that haven't been renovated since 1930s. We just learned that, in Brian's piece. So is there a strong feeling within the Fed that this is the lever to fire Fed Chair Jerome Powell?
Well, I think the Fed feels pretty confident that this is not a lever that the president will be able to use to fire Fed Chair Jerome Powell. They have said that what Chair Powell said about the renovations during congressional testimony last month was truthful, and they have really tried to explain why the cost of the project have risen over the last couple of years and the reason why they have included some of the features that they have in this renovation. So the Fed has really taken a diplomatic approach to this issue. They put a new frequently asked questions page on their website to try and explain to people what's going on with this renovation. But when you talk to legal scholars and people who watch the Fed closely, they say they don't think that this issue will rise to the level of cause, which is sort of the legal standard that the president has to meet if he were to try to remove Chair Powell from the Fed's board.
So as for the construction, what more do we know about what is being renovated? We heard asbestos removal among the many things, since it hasn't been really touched since, the 1930s. But is there also some sort of, cross-check on, how these funds are paying for certain things, if it seems to be exorbitant or simply on par, especially since, supplies have gone up considerably after the years of COVID?
Well, this is something that President Trump and his allies are going to be scrutinizing very closely. They have really been talking about this a lot in recent weeks, and you hear administration officials talking about going to do a site visit over at the renovation project to see what's going on there. And they're really asking a lot of questions about this. As your reporter said in that package, Chair Powell has also asked the Fed's own Inspector General to take a fresh look at this project. The Inspector General has done that before, but Chair Powell asked him to kind of revisit it. So there is a lot of scrutiny on this. But again, I think the Fed feels confident that there is no wrongdoing that's going to be found. As we've been talking about, this project has been going on for several years. The Fed consulted with several different boards and agencies about this as they were approving these plans and coming up with these plans. So they feel that they're on pretty good footing here.
I've driven by those marble buildings, and most people who have seen. I mean, it's a huge, colossal construction site that I think few people in the area have seen on that scale in a very, very long time. So what is the Director of Office of Management and Budget, Russ Vought, going to see if he does indeed tour the site?
I mean, I haven't been there. I don't know what's actually going on, like inside the buildings. Of course, if you're by the Fed or if you're walking along the National Mall or along Constitution Avenue there, it is very obvious that it is a huge construction project. There's a huge crane there. But I think to put this in context, like this is part of the administration's pressure campaign on Chair Powell. All of this is within the context of the fact that the administration really wants the Fed to lower interest rates. The Fed has not lowered interest rates so far this year. They've been on hold this whole year. And they have a meeting later this month, and policymakers have signaled that they're not going to lower interest rates again. And so this is all part of a campaign to put pressure on Chair Powell because the administration really wants to see interest rates come down.
And if, Trump were to move forward again on this hypothetical, and we only press on it because it really kind of is the driving, force behind the criticism coming from the Trump administration, if he were to move forward and fire Powell, and even, if he were to cite these renovations, what would it do to the markets? What kind of effect, consequences would come as a result of doing that? His job is up next year, May. But if the president were to, expedite things, what are the consequences to the economy?
To be clear, President Trump has said that he is not planning on firing Chair Powell, but he continues to discuss it, right? So it is a question worth asking. If President Trump were to move to fire Chair Powell, it would be an unprecedented move, and it would likely have very severe consequences for both the economy here in the U.S. and around the globe. One of the reasons why the U.S. economy is viewed as a stable and safe place to invest is because we have a Fed that is independent. We have a Fed that investors believe will take whatever steps are necessary to control inflation and support employment in this country, even if those steps are politically inconvenient or politically unpopular. And so if people were to start to question whether the Fed's independence was under threat, then that would have a lot of implications likely for the US dollar, for US Treasuries, and for stocks. So it would be an unprecedented move with a lot of consequences. And as you mentioned, this question is also relevant because Chair Powell's term is up next May. And so there's a lot of speculation about who he will pick to succeed Chair Powell and whether that person will continue in this decades-long tradition of protecting Fed independence.
All right, Amara Imokwe, great to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.